Hi Guy, welcome to episode 6 of the Amigarama podcast. This week's game is going to be Dungeon Master, but as usual, before we jump into that, I thought we'd have a look at a bit of news. One thing in particular that I've been dealing with, I've been putting a fair few upgrades into my newish now, Amiga 1200. I've got a Gotek drive in there, CF hard drive, PS2 adapter thingy mouse on the back. It seems that the original 1200 power supply is really struggling, and I've been having some funny power glitches, like things on the screen. The PS2 adapter doesn't really work anymore, but I've narrowed it down to definitely being the power. I mean, on top of this, I've got an 8 meg accelerator card in there. You know, I'm surprised this thing hasn't set on fire. It's that souped up. But yeah, very disappointing. But when I unplugged the Gotek drive from inside, the joystick port started working properly again and the glitches disappeared. So I'm a bit stuck really, you know, what do I do? Do I sacrifice the Gotek, or do I try and find an extra drive somewhere? I mean, I haven't got the, I don't know, you call it the electrical know-how to really make a plug to replace that end. So I'm hoping I can pick one up either off eBay, or, I mean, I did see one, I think it was on Amiga Kit, where they sold one for about £30-35. But you know, constantly out of stock. It's a bit of a struggle. So if anybody knows of one, or even has one themselves, then by all means come to the site amigarama.com and stick something in the comments. I'll definitely drop you a line, because I need to sort that power issue. Bit of news I did notice this week, but Earok, I think that's pronounced right, from Earok, EAROK.net, has just released a special edition of a Team 17 game, which is called Project X. They've done a CD32 version. On a little note, it reads, it might be bootable on a CD TV. I've not got one of them, so I can't test it, but it has been WHD loaded, front-ended. I mean, I've tried it on my 1200. It's, I thought for when I played it, the original version, it seemed like a pretty average game. I'm not really into shooters, so it's not my thing, but it's known for being very buggy. He's basically gone through, I think, with a small couple team of coders even, and they've added, I've got a list here, all 5 levels are now unlocked from the start. 5th and final level can be played in rookie mode. That's a bit of a godsend, especially for someone as terrible as games as me, because, you know, I really do struggle with shooters. Waggle to select weapon disabled. I've no idea what that actually means. Compatible with WHD load, and the big important one, the final level, level 5, no longer crashes when quitting or skipping. So, a few updates. That's the great things about fan communities and, you know, people like this coming along and being able to redo stuff to these games all these years later, because it always means you can go back to them and get an extra level of, playability out of them. One thing I did notice, basically, I've been listening to something called the Amigos podcast. I've been running through their backlog, and they've done about 120 episodes, and I only really get a chance to listen to podcasts on my way to work. I've probably got about 30 minutes in a car, so it's not, you know, I can get through a fair chunk of podcasts that way. And it's an absolutely fantastic podcast. They mentioned me a few episodes ago in the Whizball episode. I had no idea, and it's not because I've been rude or anything, or I've purposely avoided mentioning them. It's just because I've been going through their entire backlog, and I think I'm up to about episode 80, and it was just by accident. I started at the same time listening to some of the newer ones, just so I could, you know, on the side, so I could start getting through this backlog. And they mentioned me, and I was like, oh my god, they're a huge podcast. They run a site called everythingamiga.com. Full of technical articles, not just podcast stuff, but YouTube videos, forum on there, big community and everything. They're weekly as well, so I got a bit of a competitor there. But yeah, it's a great podcaster and well worth going listening to. Moving on to this week's game, I wanted to pick something that I really didn't have any experience with, but seems to have a lot of praise and love, and one of the real standout titles, and that would be Dungeon Master. No matter where you look online, it's very, very fondly remembered, and I think a lot of it comes from the fact when it came out, I think it was 1987, I've got in my notes, but the whole Dungeons and Dragons craze was, well, I think it was coming towards the tail end, but it was a thing in the 80s, you know. It's what drew kids in, and fantasy and magic and all that was really taking off during the 80s, and this just got on the back of the coattails of that, so to speak, and it just drew people in, and, you know, it was the way things were at the time. I mean, misspent youth, what can I say? Anyway, the game itself was developed by and published at the same time by a company called FTL, which I believe stands for Faster Than Light, and it was, yeah, as I've said before, released in 1987. It just came on a single disc. I did have to double check that, especially after playing it, because I was quite surprised that it was on one, as it were, because you think something this huge, you'll understand as I go on and explain. On top of that, I also saw a pretty good extensive making of article in issue 34 of Retro Gamer magazine. Now, it was quite an old one. I mean, 34, God knows what they're up to now. It's almost 200 or something like that, or 180 issues. It's quite high up, so I had to go real digging back into the history. But originally it started off as a game called Crystal Dragon for the Apple II. And I think that all fell through in the early days. That was about 84, 85 when that was being designed. Yeah, it's pretty old. And then it was pushed mainly onto the Atari ST when they were coming out to 16-bit machines and stuff, and all the scrapping and whatever was happening between Commodore and Atari. And then, you know, this was meant to be one of their big games. And one of the strangest things about it's one of the first fully mouse-driven games. You do not use the keyboard whilst you play, which sounds very odd, but at the time there was nothing really like this. On top of that, it was all set in real time, so when you went into the dungeon, down corridors and stuff, even if you were going into your inventory and messing around with healing or spells or food or whatever, everything was moving around. You could get in a situation where you're just minding your own business, and then, you know, enemies can come after you and follow you and that sort of thing. And it made for a very strange and creepy atmosphere, because you never quite knew, the further you went in, just what was going to happen. And the great thing is, as a game at the time when it first came out, there've been nothing really like it to this degree, you know, with these sort of like 3D roaming dungeons in that sort of style, and so many games were inspired by it. You know, things like Eye of the Beholder, Lands of Lore, even Richard Garriott said about Ultima 6, you know, borrows heavily from that graphical interface, because it really inspired him to do, some pretty interesting things with the game of his own. So this is pretty much a standout title. Now, there was meant to be, what I was reading, that there was going to be 3 expansion packs just released as packing discs. So you'd have the main game, you'd stick an extra disc in, and it'd all boost the dungeons and things like that. But they only ever got around to releasing one called Chaos Strikes Back. Now, I have had a look at that. It's pretty much just like the main game. It's just different, but we're not going to be looking at that one today. But the idea fell apart because they were doing so many ports for different systems of the games, and they were such a small company, they just didn't have the time or the money, and it was quite successful. I think it sold about 40,000 games on its original release. I think that might be the Atari ST release, but for a game, you know, at that time with the sort of market, it was very, very impressive. Now, they did come out, because it was quite a top seller for them, but they did do a sequel for it called Dungeon Master 2 Skull Keep. Now, there is an AGA version of that. I have had a very brief glimpse of it just after I played the main game, because I was just interested to see what it would look like, you know, a few years later, how they would expand it. And graphically is a huge improvement, but we probably will come back to that at a much later date. But it was very interesting to see how this first game, because it's quite basic in a way when you first play it, but how they've gone about it in the sequel is, and they've just boosted everything that came with it originally. Anyway, that's another game. We don't want to worry about that. One of the other things I did note that there was about 5 people working on this. But just reading from one of the interviews I read, it was a chap called Doug Bell and Dennis Walker, and they did about 90% of the coding and graphics, and, pretty much a 2-man team there, really, probably with assists with sound and, probably the other bits of coding around the edges and stuff. So this was a pretty impressive bit of coding. Now, any good D&D games need to have a fitting story to go with it, and the one from the manual for this doesn't let us down. I'll just read out the opening paragraph. Many champions have been sent into the dungeon with the quest to recover Ribosolus, the Grey Lord Firestaff. With the Firestaff, Librasolus can take physical form again and defeat Lord Chaos. Goodness. The player is Ferron, the apprentice of the Grey Lord, that goes into the dungeon with the task to resurrect 4 champions and guide them through the dungeon to find the Firestaff and defeat Lord Chaos. And that's it. That's all you get. That's the entire introduction to what little story there is. Now, when you first start up the game, which is a bit of a shame, because there was so much space taken up on the single disc, they had to cut back on things like music, any intro story, any sort of movie. It's very odd to have such a 3D game with all these great visuals and stuff, and there's no real in-game story that drives you on beyond the odd scroll that you pick up along the way. Now, the game as a whole, it's a 3D maze labyrinth style game where you're basically wandering around and dealing with monsters and finding locks for doors, avoiding traps and things. You do have a goal and a quest towards the end. But the interesting thing about it, as you're moving through this 3D space, usually in games like this, I really struggle, because I tend to get lost very easily. But the great thing about this is the levels aren't really complicated, so you can pretty much, there's lots of the odd standout points here and there and landmarks, and you can always pick up on the odd thing like statue or doors or traps and things. And even if you end up in some sort of a circle, it's never too difficult to work out where you need to be to go forward, to go back, which is always a plus for a game like this. Now, it also adding that it's got this fantastic interface, which is all driven by the left mouse button, as I said earlier. But the thing is, that's absolutely everything. There are no keyboard presses whatsoever. You do not have to press a single key on the keyboard. And that's quite original, even for a game like this at the time. There wasn't many, like I for the inventory, E for options, for opening doors and things like that. So it makes for a very intriguing game to play, because you focus entirely, your mouse, everything you do is like a little hand pointer on the screen. Now, when you first start off, you're allowed to pick 4 characters out of the Hall of Champions, and you get a choice between things like warriors, ninjas, mage, there's a spell system, that sort of thing. You can throw weapons, you can go charging in there with swords and things. You can even pick up a bow and arrow. Now, as you adventure in, you don't just get like a full set of basic weapons when you begin. There's very limited choice. You get things like daggers and a couple of throwing stars if you're lucky. But it's very easy to get stuck in a rut and not find a decent weapon, because a lot of these things really are hidden in very clever places. Now, that might be a simple thing like behind a picture frame, which is one of the earliest things, are all hidden behind something on an altar. Everything that you need is like either hidden on the screen or it's under something. You move something to one side, you see it there. It's all very simple click, you're not dragging stuff left and right and moving it around. And again, it works so well with that interface. Now, to add to this, one of the games in a way is a problem is the fact that there is no music, and that's because of the size limitations, because of what they were trying to do. But the atmosphere is absolutely spot on, because you have like creaking doors, portcullises which drop with a metallic sound, like heartbeats and effects, and one thing you can do is you can run into walls accidentally, which always seemed a bit odd, but it will drain a bit of health. But the thing is that you make a little noise when you do that. So you'll learn as you play not to get stuck in a rut, because you don't want to be doing that too often, because then you'll run out of energy. Now you have a couple of bars of energy. You've got like mana, food and water. As you're moving around constantly, you've got to keep this balance going, because your characters can starve, and if they starve, they die, and then you've got to go back to reincarnate them, and you can lose things like experience and, your typical RPG tropes there. But then again, they weren't really tropes at the time, were they? Because it was all new and it was exciting. Now, you can go into the inventory as well it always reminds me of Baldur's Gate, that style with it's grid based. You've got very nice simple things like a mouth which you use to eat, an eye, you drag an object over to the eye, click it, and you'll get a brief description. Now, one of the things you have to do, because there's not like any shops in the game or anything, you don't really interact with any other people down there. It's just, it's mostly monsters. I mean, there's nothing else but monsters. But you have to build a skill. You can't just pick up a sword and then you find, it's like, it's Thor's hammer, this big amazing weapon, and I'll just start bashing things in. It's not that simple, I'm afraid, because you have to actually get your character to appraise it, and they have to have either a high enough skill level or they have to build it up, which can be a bit of a pain in the backside, but it also keeps you like stocking weapons to some degree and always having something decent to hand. You can also throw your weapons, which is always quite funny. But the great thing about it is all the characters do need skills to be able to do all this stuff. You can get in situations where it's easy to get lost and you're stuck in a trap. One of the interesting puzzles I saw is you go into this nice big room, and there's one door across the room from you, but there's buttons dotted. Every step presses a button which either opens a gate or drops it. And the problem is, if you just run straight forward, by the time you get to the gate, it'll be shut. So you've got to go back into the room and then move your way through the room correctly so that you end up going out through the right pattern to get to the other side, which is a bit of a fantastic puzzle, actually. And it was a nice surprise. And there's one of them quite early on as well. That's another great thing about it. It really does just ease you into this. You get to experience things bit by bit. It doesn't just open the full dungeon and start throwing the horrors at you straight away. You do have to go down a couple of staircases before the difficulty increases. Now, there's lots of monsters dotted around as you're walking throughout the dungeon, and one of the first ones you come across is a mummy that is trapped behind a portcullis. And as you open this, you've got a choice. You can either run in there and attack, which is the attack system is very, very simple. You've got your weapons down the right hand side. You go running up to it and then you just keep clicking them until it dies, or you cast a magic spell. Now, the monsters themselves are all pretty basic. There's not very many frames to them. I think that's because of the size limits on the disc again. But there's a good variety as you're wandering about. And even in the very early stages, like things like the mummy, and there was these green things with like slimy mouths. I don't quite know how to describe them, but there's a good array of monsters. It's not just like one or two the same repeated to infinity. Things like skeletons in there, and you name it, your D&D trope, and it's in there. I can see why this is seen as one of people's favourite Amiga games, because even from the early days of the Amiga, it's quite addictive. I mean, I found myself just sat there playing. I meant to spend about 20 minutes as a quick dabble at first, and before I knew it, I'd spent an hour, and that was the first time I'd ever played it, or really a game to any length. I mean, I'm about 3 hours in so far, and I'm having all sorts of fun with it, which is a good sign for a game. I mean, I think when I've finished the podcast, I'm actually going to go back and play it for a bit, because I'm quite determined to finish it. But at the same time, it does have a couple of niggles there and there. I mean, I do not like the magic symbol system. In order to use your mage or your sorcerer or whatever, they're very, very, very basic. There's no colour coding or anything like that. You have to spell out magic spells with symbols in order to cast them, which in turn drains mana. But the thing is, I got a bit stressed a few times because I'm trying to remember these different symbols to cast the spell, and what I ended up doing in the end is I stuck a weapon on my mage, and most of the time I just couldn't be bothered, so I was just clicking him to bash them over the head, which isn't really the way to use a mage. But again, that's a bit of a problem with that quick system, that it's always going, they're always coming at you, they're always going to be attacking, so you've got to be on your toes. As you're walking around, you've got to find food and water, and it is a bit of a constant battle, but I thought the whole thing was very, very balanced well with that. You can see why they cram so much into this game, and even though the main design doesn't really change because it's constantly grey brick walls as you're moving around, but the monsters do, and it's different design levels. It does have a lack of music, but I found it's actually quite terrifying. I mean, that sounds very strange, but when you walk through a door and then you get that creaking sound, and you got your heartbeats going, and even the monsters as they move toward, the sound effects were spot on. I mean, it's a real shame I don't know why they didn't put in a second disc. They could have expanded it so much more. But again, it was just probably at the time, even though it sold really well, it was a very, very small company. But yeah, I mean, is that a bad point? A game being too addictive? I'm not entirely sure, but I really am struggling just to pick on any part of it. I mean, you got to consider, again, for the time when it came out, this was groundbreaking. The much later games that come out, like Eye of the Beholder, which went to much greater lengths and much more detailed RPG, this doesn't compare in that sense because it doesn't have that sort of depth, but at the same time, it has enough going for it to keep you entertained. When I sat down to play this, I really didn't know what to expect. I mean, probably my earliest experiences with this sort of game is probably like Fantasy Star on the Master System back in the day, but that was an entirely different sci-fi adventure, nothing to do with this, but the similar sort of like the labyrinth and the mazes, and but with this one doesn't really have those sort of RPG elements. But the thing is, it's very fast, it's very fluid, you run through the dungeon, you attack the monsters, you go exploring, you do this, you do that. And it's incredibly creepy and it's spooky at the same time. And there's not really much going on, but because of the balance of the sound effects and the way it all works together, there's enough there to draw you into what, there's not really much there, I suppose, in a way of a game. But again, if you're having that much fun, what does it matter? I mean, this is one of those I really wish I'd played as a kid, because it would have just blown me away at the time. I mean, not really that I don't think I got a chance to play many RPGs. I was too much into, graphic adventure games, but I really wish I had done it. What a shame. But I'm definitely going to be returning to this one after the podcast. But yeah, so this one definitely gets the thumbs up from me. It's a great game. I recommend you go back and play it. It's probably the sequel is probably better, and there's better later games, but this is well worth dabbling in. Yeah, I enjoyed it. I really did. Anyway, guys, what a perfect place to finish. Now, as you know, pretty new podcast. I'm about 6 episodes in now. I'm having a lot of fun with this, and I'm managing to keep up with the weekly episodes, but I could do with a little bit of support. I mean, I've had a couple of reviews on iTunes, but the more the merrier, just because that helps me get recognised and pushing me up lists and things, and there's a chance that more people will discover the podcast, and we can just about see where it goes. If you've enjoyed today's episode or want to ask some questions or even suggest other games, then by all means go to AmigaRama.com or go to Facebook.com/AmigaRama. I've got a page on there, and stick something in the comments, guys. I will reply, and it's all appreciated. Until next time.